Once you realise that, it's very difficult not to open your eyes and begin to examine other issues. And I think migration is probably one of them. I think climate change, like all the big issues that are forced down our throats.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. Today we're going to be talking about our cover piece. It is Motherland, and this is Reform's new pathway to win over votes from the women. Is it a strategy? I'm not so sure, but to discuss this, I'm joined by Tim Shipman, who has written the piece, and Kellie-Jay Keen. She is the founder and leader of the Party for Women and has been a single issue campaigner for several years. Now, Tim, does Nigel Farage have a woman problem?
Well, Farage himself used to say he had a woman problem. When he was quizzed about this in the run-up to the local elections by a journalist, he said, "I've had 40 years of it," says the bloke who's been married twice, separated twice, got 4 kids, and every political cause he's ever espoused has had far more male support than female. But that is changing. At the general election last year, 58% of Reform support came from men. It's now about equalised, and the biggest sort of change in polling over the last year has been a rise in female voters for Reform, particularly in those amongst middle-aged women, 45 to 60 and 60 to 75. For Reform is now leading amongst women. You look around at what's been going on and the protests on migration, fears about crime, which are big issues that Farage has been pushing. You've seen a lot of the protests being led by women, some of them women from Reform. And that appears to be something that Farage is capitalising on.
But this just happens to be an accidental benefit for Reform. It's not been exactly a strategy, has it?
No, not until now. I think, Farage has not gone after women in the sort of sense of, here's a childcare policy or here's something that's sort of tailored for women. He just seems to have picked up support from people who are concerned about the state of the country. And if you look at the polling, we've got a lot of numbers in the piece this week from pollsters More in Common. They show that women are much more likely than men to be dissatisfied with the state of things. They think Britain is on the wrong track. They're concerned about crime. They're concerned about the safety of their children. And they're concerned about migration. And with all of those things, this support has sort of developed organically, but I get the impression that having spotted what's going on, Reform will try and lean into this and make the most of it.
And Kelly, that is an interesting statistic that women are more downbeat than men about Britain. Are you one of these women? Because I've interviewed you a few times now and you've come on Spectator TV several times, and your views have sort of broadened from a single issue campaigner.
Yeah, well, I think that's because we've the tipping of people not talking about it to talking about it has happened. So it's now a bit more commonplace that people are talking about it, even if the action in sort of adjusting the UK back to something of some sort of normal state is going to be very slow. And there's a lot of fight back amongst trans activists, including, I would argue, people working in schools who are trying to teach children about this nonsense. So I think it's going to be quite a slow turnaround. However, I felt that we'd reached a point where I could talk about the other issues that I think impact women in particular. I was a raging, in quote marks, Islamophobe before it was fashionable. So I'd sort of talked about the grooming gangs a long, long time ago, and then stopped talking about it so I could really tackle a single issue and not be not have people come and attack me for other things whilst I was talking about that single issue to unite women. But, obviously childcare, the fact that every campaign in the general election, aside from Reform, talked about this free childcare and breakfast clubs and getting our kids into school as quickly and for as long as possible. So, we've certainly broadened out at the Party of Women. And I think it was necessary. But, I'm glad Reform's listening to women, whether that's a strategy or not. I don't think so. I think it's just common sense, and a lot of us are beginning to sort of see things in front of us that we just can't quite believe.
Mm-hmm. But there are some cracks in Reform's policies. For example, Vanessa Frake, Kellie-Jay, what did you think of her, the former prison governor, and some of her stances on whether men should be in women's prisons?
It's very common that people seem to think women are just men without penises. It's a very bizarre thing. And I think there's something that happens that people think, well, if you're willing to cut off your genitals, then you must be a really vulnerable individual. And I think we need to do some work to dispel that myth. I don't think you are at all. And you certainly don't change sex. I think it was a misstep. Look, I met with Richard Tice, Lee Anderson, and Mr. Farage back along. And Richard certainly and Lee certainly are saying the sort of things that I would want to hear as a voter. They are talking about eradicating the Gender Recognition Act and also the Equality Act and leaving the European Court on Human Rights. So those sorts of things are welcome as far as I'm concerned. It'd have been nice if they didn't ghost me after that, to be fair. But yeah, it was an interesting conversation. So I think they know what they're talking about. I just maybe Frake and Farage need a bit of I don't know, talking to.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to come back to that ghosting, Kelly. But before we go on to that, Tim, I want to ask you about these protests, because you wrote about the migrant hotels becoming a big problem for Labour last week. And it seems like now that women are appearing and protesting and saying, I don't want my children's schools to have HMOs next door to them, things are starting to change compared to the migrant hotel protests last year after the Southport riots.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, this has been organic to a degree, but Reform are obviously getting involved in now helping to organise some of these protests. It's where a lot of the issues that Kelly's been talking about all come together. So you've got an issue of migration and how that affects local services, which women in particular probably have a view on, perhaps more than men, but also the nature of some of these migrants. In Epping, an Ethiopian migrant who had been here, I think, only around a week, is accused of sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. And I think there's a sense that Farage has certainly made this point in his press conferences, that some of the people coming here, he would argue, don't share our sort of cultural values and don't have that same respect for women and children. It's that has become a problem. I think the Vanessa Frake thing is interesting as well, because while Farage is capitalising on this kind of upsurge of public anger about migration, getting Vanessa Frake in as a sort of advisor on his justice and prisons policy sort of reveals some of the problems that he might have going forward. They've talked about bringing in experts, not, having cabinet ministers who aren't necessarily people who are in Parliament, but are people with an expertise. We've seen,
perhaps Kelly.
Well, quite. We've seen retired police officers on the platform with him doing his crime campaign. Vanessa Frake ran a prison. She was the head of security at Wormwood Scrubs. She knows of what she speaks. But I was at that press conference where Farage got a question about trans women in jails, and he kind of deferred to her. I think he was being polite, and she gave a sort of equivocal answer, and he didn't really override it. But this is the problem to a degree. When you bring in more of these outside people, you're going to have a situation where not all of them are necessarily completely up to speed with what Reform thinks, or might have different views to the sort of people who've founded the party and been leading it for some time. And this is the challenge that Farage is going to face, upscaling, Reform from a start-up party that's done very, very well into something that might be a government in waiting. And I think you're going to get more and more of these instances where people aren't necessarily, on message when they've just been brought on board.
And Kelly, does that go back to the point that I've seen you've written before, that really you want a Conservative party to be conservative, and the Reform UK is just a vessel from which you can, protest?
It's true that they are potentially a government in waiting. I mean, who's going to vote? Conservatives, I think, it's just totally lost their way. I couldn't even tell you of what they really stand for at the moment, and I don't think they could either. And I think Labour are just power hungry, and it's insane what's happening. So I think Reform are going to be on target for pretty good results in the next election, if not taking it. Because I think Labour are going to just do so much to make us all think there is, we wouldn't want them to run our household, let alone the country. So they've got to get it right. But I agree that going from sort of a bit of an ambition of Farage to get out of the EU and then to look at what's happening with migration to then run a country and have people around you that don't want to sort of half kill you in your sleep, as well as undermine you. I think that's going to be the tricky thing, but I hope he makes it, because I think the general public in this country, we deserve a really firm opposition, if not a firm government. But at the moment, we have neither.
And Tim, one of the things we've not spoken about yet are the high-profile women that have joined Reform, one of which, I have to say, Lyndon Kemal-Karen. She used to work at The Spectator. Could you tell us about some of these women?
Well, I mean, we've got the first female MP, Sarah Pochin, who won in Runcorn, which is where Farage said he first detected this kind of upsurge of women voters flocking to his standard. In Wales, Laura Ann Jones defected from the Tories. She's become their first member of the Senate, which they're hoping to take control of next May. And then perhaps most interesting is Laila Cunningham, who's a Tory former councillor, former prosecutor in London, who I'm told they think could have a decent shot at becoming London mayor. So that contest next comes up in 2028. Her and Sarah Pochin have been, who's a magistrate, have both helped Farage with the crime campaign he's been running. And frankly, he's been holding a press conference every Monday. The government hasn't done a lot during the recess, and the Tories perhaps arguably even less, and Reform are kind of making the running, and they've used these high profile women to help front that campaign with Farage. So the Tweedy kind of reputation that they used to have, of being the sort of natural home of the Red Trouser Brigade, that's changing a little bit. And again, Farage is quite happy to share a platform with these women and give a slightly different impression to the public at large.
Kellie-Jay, one of the things that Tim writes about in his piece is that a problem Farage will also have is the Donald Trump issue. Donald Trump is often very unpopular with a lot of women. But from your perspective, I also wondered whether you think Tommy Robinson could become a problem for Farage when it comes to women.
Well, unfortunately, I sit in a different space to most women in that
I suspected as much.
I really do like Donald Trump. And I think Tommy Robinson is a folk hero that I don't think should be ignored. I think he's really managing to get hold of people's support. Many people I meet now who used to sort of utter his name in whispers are now beginning to say, well, actually, he did do the things that he says he's done. And often the things that he's been accused of, he hasn't done. And I think we are beginning to see that whether you like him or not, whether you think he's all the bad things or all the great things, he has been treated abysmally by this country and by the justice system. So I don't know. Does he have a Tommy? I think probably he has to distance himself from Tommy Robinson, sort of politically, but I don't know if overall that's going to be the best thing. It's difficult, isn't it? Because he's damned if he does, and he's damned if he doesn't.
And your followers, do they typically agree with you on this?
Well, do they agree with me? I think I always feel I'm a little bit ahead of the curve, and I certainly am when it comes to the feeling around Robinson.
Okay.
I think more people are just waking up. I think once you step over the line of realizing that the mainstream media and the way the sort of the national thought on something is totally wrong, like dishonest, wrong, misrepresented lies, like the idea that a child can be born in the wrong body. Once you realize that, it's very difficult not to open your eyes and begin to examine other issues. And I think migration is probably one of them. I think climate change, like all the big issues that are forced down our throats repeatedly. So I hope more people wake up. You don't have to agree with me on any of these issues, but you do have to at least know why you have the opinion that you have.
Tim, we always talk about Farage's Tommy Robinson problem, but I think it's taken a different theme this week, maybe with the migrant hotels issue, and obviously Tommy Robinson getting arrested, now released, is in the news a lot. What do you think of what Kellie said?
Well, look, I think she's right that moderate mainstream opinion has moved on net zero. I think it's moved on trans rights, but I think Farage would need to be very careful about dallying with Tommy Robinson. There's just too many dubious connections there, and this is a guy who appears to have been arrested for assault. There's some video that looks pretty leery, and Farage, to his credit, I think has been pretty clear that he doesn't want anything to do with Tommy Robinson. He's been fairly consistent about that. In fact, in the 20 years I've known Nigel Farage, one of his big arguments is, I'm the one who defeated the far right in this country. I destroyed the BNP by giving people a more respectable alternative to voting BNP. There was a big upsurge in that in the 90s, and the rise of UKIP and the Brexit Party kind of marginalised that kind of thing. And I think the argument in favour of Farage really is that he's the last alternative to things getting really out of control. I think Kelly's an interesting voice on a lot of things, but on this I think she's way outside the mainstream view, and at the risk of sounding like a patsy member of the mainstream media, I don't think the vast majority of people that Farage now wants to win over, he's got the votes of people who are concerned about migration. His challenge to be Prime Minister is to broaden that, and having anything to do with Tommy Robinson is exactly the kind of thing that's going to frighten the horses and stop people who might be tempted because they're disgruntled with the way things are going. They think that the two big parties have let them down over a period of decades, and they're desperate for someone to come in and do things differently. But I think if he looks like he's getting into bed with Tommy Robinson, that could kill everything stone dead, bluntly.
Well, look, I agree. I think if you're going to reach moderates and you're going to become the next government, you probably have to be very, very careful who you associate with at all. I maybe think that there's a third way, and that's neither support nor stand against. And I think that might serve him well to sort of just say, you can talk about the man that I think has, and I really don't like to sort of associate him with far right. I think that would be unfair of me not to disagree with any association like that. I don't think the people that follow him are far right, but we all get smeared with that particular accusation, which is perhaps why I'm really, really careful not to do that. But yeah, look, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And there will be some diehard fans of Farage that overlap with fans of Robinson and supporters of Robinson. But you can't, as you rightly point out, if you want to get into government, you just have to be very careful. And I would add that having a photo taken and being a fan of Andrew Tate would also turn a lot of women off. And I think Farage would do well to distance himself very, very, very far away from that particular individual.
If Reform UK was to reapproach you and offer you a role, what would you be willing to take?
Whatever furthers my ambition of ensuring that women and girls are protected in this country would be something that I would always pursue. Richard Tice has my number. They can just call me back. It's quite easy. I was mid call with Mr. Tice. He got called away, and that was the last I ever heard of them. So I'd be more than happy to work with anyone. I said I'd stand with the devil himself if it meant not another child was harmed, and so I would. I'd be open to anything.
Can I just ask, Kelly, what was the call about?
Well, it was about when would be a good time. If I were to join, when would be a good time to do so? Oh. Like that was the meeting with Farage. It was I went for a quick lunch with Mr. Tice, Mr. Anderson, and they said, "Oh, we'd like you to meet Nigel." And then for whatever reason, I have no idea, there was an urgent situation, and I never heard from them again.
Well, Mr. Farage, if you are watching, then Kellie-Jay Keen is just a phone call away. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for watching.